So Professor Guterl is a historian of race and nation. He's written 4 books: Seeing Race in America, Josephine Baker and the Rainbow Tribe, and some others, which I'm not going to read now because this doesn't list them by name and I don't want to get it wrong. Right now, he's working on a global biography of the queer, cosmopolitan, human rights activist Roger Casement, and a book on class passing, cross-dressing, and race passing. He's been awarded fellowships from the National Museum of American History, Yale University, Rice, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. In 2010, he was the winner of the Mary C. Turpie Prize given by the American Studies Association for distinguished teaching, service, and program development. And he's a marvelous colleague, as so many of you know, and we're just delighted to welcome Matt here with us today. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Tricia, and thank you. Thanks to Tricia for doing this. Thanks to Stephanie for doing a lot of the logistics. Thanks to Ellie and to Maggie for making it happen and making me look good and sound good. And thanks to everybody here. I'm quite terrified at the number of people I know in the room. And so I've already said that if I raise my hand, it's a sign for someone to bring me a cocktail. So if I do that, I would love for somebody to just run out and grab something. We're here to talk about a book that I wrote largely in secret, a memoir that I wrote during COVID time when we all sort of turned inward in our lives. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about the book, just a few minutes, and then read the preface of the book, and then we'll do some Q&A afterwards.
Fantastic.
It's a book I've been working on, as I said, during most of COVID time, but if I were to think a little bit more deeply, I might say that I'd been working on it since I started working on Josephine Baker, and I might say that I've been working on it for my whole life. In some ways, the kinds of questions that emerged from the family in which I was raised have been with me for a long time. And so the memoir itself is both a challenge to talk about and a challenge to write, but a pleasure to get out of myself. And I think it's a necessary condition of writing a memoir, is that they're often heavy with things you don't necessarily want to share. And so again, a terrifying context in which to talk about a private life I had long kept private. I also wrote all my thoughts out on note cards, but I won't read them, and I don't think I have to. The title of the book requires some explanation, and I think before I read the preface, I just want to sort of, I don't want to assume that people understand or know the Zora Neale Hurston aphorism that all my skinfolk ain't my kinfolk. And for Hurston, that's a warning. And I think it's worth remembering that what she's trying to warn her audience, which she presumes to be Black, is that just because someone is a member of the family or marked by a skin tone that puts them within the race, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're an ally. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a sense of solidarity or intimacy. For me, that aphorism really intrigued me for the opposite reason. And as much as I was drawn to Hurston's use of it, the family that I grew up in, which is a large multiracial adoptive family, twisted the lines of kin and skin in very interesting ways. And my kinfolk weren't my skinfolk. And that was a reversal of Hurston's warning in some sense. So I appreciate the kind of guarded tone of her aphorism, and also appreciate the kind of genuine desire to transcend the lines of color and skin within the family, and to find a sense of connection that me and my siblings have long sought with each other, imperfectly or otherwise. The preface that I'm about to read from you has a set of rules, operating rules, that aren't clear. So there's a note to readers at the front about the naming of my siblings, and it's worth saying a little bit about that up front too before I start to read it, that before I started to write, I approached them all to let them know that I was writing this memoir, and asked basically what they would like me to take into consideration. Some of them said nothing. Some of them laughed at the very preposterous idea that I would write a memoir, and others gave me a set of instructions. And so the naming of the children in the book is in many ways a synthesis of what we all call each other and what they have asked me to call them. So we can talk about the names afterwards, but know that I have a set of rules that I am obligated to follow when discussing my siblings' names, and that they're not always here by choice. And I think that's sort of an important condition of the text. I'll also try to do this artfully, because listening to me for exactly 17 minutes is never a pleasure. So a young white couple sit patiently in two mid-century chairs, waiting for their chance to make history. The man is lean, tall, and dark-haired, with a slight expectant smile on his face. The woman is blonde with blue eyes, her hair swept back over her shoulders in a late 1960s sort of way. They're in a crowded, dimly lit waiting area surrounded by strangers, some of whom are seated in a long row of those same chairs while others mill about. The young couple cling to each other nervously, making small talk. An hour builds and they watch as anonymous strangers pass them by or swirl around them. Like everyone else in the space, they're anticipating something remarkable, something life-changing, something wild and radical. The man leads forward, his hands clenched in his lap. He absent-mindedly twists his wedding ring. Her eyes focus on a doorway, on a door, on a doorknob, watching for even the slightest turn or rattle, or for some sign that the gray metal portal is about to sweep open and reveal their destiny. It is 1972. The scene is JFK International Airport, a place famous for arrivals and departures. They had each been to Queens when they were younger, independently and with their parents, only a few years before that night at the airport. Before as well they meet, date, and get married. They are among the millions standing before the Unisphere at the 1964 World's Fair. Like many, they're awed by the massive 140-foot tall sculpture of the planet and are beguiled by the fair's catchy slogan, "Peace through understanding," suggesting that as the world gets smaller, it might also grow more collegial. There's a striking Disney exhibit at the fair, later turned into the centerpiece of Disney World, into a soft drink slogan, into a national wish. It's a Small World, after all, features a boat tour around the globe, an introduction to children on every continent, singing together about the dazzling interconnections of a planet, and celebrating the idea that under the technicolor skin tones and beneath the ethnic dress, everyone is the same. The Unisphere and the Disney exhibit are inspiring, but the two young white people both leave troubled. Change, they know, isn't merely an advertising catchphrase. It demands planning, intention, and action. The World's Fair sticks with them. When they meet for the first time a few years later as young adults, they bond over their global concerns and discover a shared desire to build a better world. At the airport in 1972, the couple turn their attention to a small group of adults circling them. Most are pacing, a reflection of their anxiety, which seems to course through the space. The strangers are all paired off, sharing a common role as prospective parents, which is what brings them to this lonely side of the airport. Some are older and some are younger, but all are coupled. No one is here alone. No one has brought a grandparent or another child. All are white. The doorknob finally turns, and in a burst of activity, the jetway doors swing open and a gaggle of children enter the terminal. Some walk hand in hand with smiling stewardesses, those recognizable icons of the decade. The tiny fingers of children are curled inside the older hands of their minder. Some are infants, half asleep or with their eyes wide open, and are swaddled and carried by stern and serious adoption agents who survey the prospective parents with a judging eye. Some walk on their own, old enough to be independent. These older children seem afraid or nervous or excited or all of these things at once. None of the children are white. All come from Korea. For a moment, the flood of children pauses. The two groups face each other. The adults in the waiting room crane their necks, clasping their hands together in anticipation. And then, one by one, with patience and attention to detail, the line breaks. The stewardesses and agents hustle here and there, clipboards in hand, to ensure that every Asian child is delivered to their new white parents. Identification is checked and double-checked, papers are signed, handshakes are offered and accepted. The young woman with the blonde hair finds herself cradling an infant wearing a red, white, and blue jumper. She gazes with wonderment in her eyes. The young man bends down, laughs, and wags a finger playfully in front of the child. Suddenly and happily, they're oblivious to everyone else and awestruck. The emotions of the couple echo widely in the room. The quiet nervousness in the space has been replaced by animated conversation, punctuated by gestures that are meant to bridge a stark language gap. Tears run down faces. In almost every case, this is the very first meeting of child and parents, and there's the shock of the embrace, of the tactile memory that is created when you physically hold on to a person for the first time, when you touch their skin. As the chorus of introductions crests, a photographer bobs and weaves through the crowd, the shutter on his camera clicking audibly and the flash blooming repeatedly. And then, suddenly and all at once, each of these new expanded families departs for the exits, leaving the antiseptic space of the airport, the row of plastic chairs, and the metal door to the jetway. In groups of 3, they make their way out into the night towards some version of home. It is late at night, and this is just the beginning. In 24 homes in the tri-state area, there are other family members waiting for a grander embrace. There are banners hung over fireplaces reading welcome. There are casseroles and potato chips out for everyone. There are aunts and uncles pulling back the curtain, watching for the family car to pull up the driveway, readying for another round of embraces, of tears, of animated gestures, anticipating the haptic souvenirs forged when skin meets skin. It will be a long while before everyone, children included, is asleep. The tall, dark-haired man and the blonde, blue-eyed woman and their infant son from Korea head to a parking lot. They have many hours of driving ahead of them. It is almost morning when they pull up to the White House with the white picket fence where they have made a home. This is their story, our story, the story of a large, multiracial adoptive family assembled in suburban New Jersey in the middle of the Cold War. It is a story that begins with the conception of a beneficent idea by an idealistic young couple. The 2 handsome young people are Bob and Sheryl, our parents, and the child in their arms is Bug, our brother, whose life began in Korea. They bring Bug home that night, driving for hours along the Belt Parkway, through Staten Island, back to me in New Jersey. There are many origin points in our story, but that endless white-knuckled car ride home from the airport is a clear one, a foundational moment that hews closely to the prevailing narrative of adoption, where generous white parents open their hearts and their homes to less fortunate children of color, orphaned by war, famine, or some combination of disastrous circumstances, and draw them into the American way. Our story upends the conventions of that narrative. In the end, there are 6 of us, a live cliche. I am born in the summer of 1970, the white first child with blonde hair and blue eyes. Bug, a nickname so old that it has no genesis we can recall, is our first adoptive addition, but not our last. Mark, another biological white son, is born in 1973. 2 years later, we adopt Bear, a mixed-race Black Asian child brought out of Saigon. He is days older than me, just barely 5 years old when he arrives, having celebrated his birthday in the bowels of a military transport plane. Anna, our older adopted sister, arrives from Seoul in 1977 when she is 13, a beautiful Asian and white child, a proto-adult and surrogate mother to us all. Our youngest sibling, Eddie, adorable, black, and with a quick smile, is our last adoption, arriving at 6 years old in 1983 from the South Bronx. The cycle of acquisition and incorporation stops there, and yet our story continues. From the moment of our creation, we are an Arcadian experiment. a varied ensemble of kids of different races raised together by a visionary couple in a white clapboard house with a white picket fence in a town so small and so quaint that it might have been a movie set. Our father, Bob, is a prominent man in the county, and our generous creation is a part of his reputation. Sheryl, our mother, is an even-keeled idealist, committed to making a better world possible, an effort that begins, she insists, in the home. Our place in their experiment is clear. Clear because we discuss it at the breakfast table, a big, broad, heavy thing which our parents have purchased to ensure that we all have room with extra leaves that allow for a dozen. Clear because it is inscribed in our public persona as political objects, in our clothing, our assemblage as a platoon, our orchestration for photographs. Clear because other people comment on us, or ask about us, or express incomprehension about us. Even as we expand from 2 to 4 to 6, we understand that our multiracial composition is a critique of the present, our colorblind consanguinity an omen of the future. We are the mechanical dolls of the subterranean Disney exhibit at the World's Fair brought to life, singing of tears and hopes and fears, imploring our public to wake up and recognize the chaos that humans have wrought. We are a reminder of the good and the bad, of the consequences of war and violence, of the end time that is coming. We have a good, if somewhat peculiar life. We are not poor. We are not physically abused. We do not suffer physical violence at the hands of cruel parents. We are adored. We're supported at home. We have everything we need insofar as we, or anyone, understands what is needed for a family like ours. Everything we need except, of course, for a popular template. There is nothing on television, in books, or in film that matches our experience. Just about every family we see on screen is impossibly white. The Partridges of California, the Ingalls of Minnesota, the Waltons of Virginia, the Cunninghams of Milwaukee. Even the large blended families we encounter on the Brady Bunch or 8 is Enough are unfailingly, unquestionably white. The Bible is a more useful guide. Early on, I am taught to see the house with the white picket fence as a biblical ark for the age of the nuclear bomb, of race riots, and of war. Presiding at the kitchen table, Bob butters his bread at the start of dinner and recalls the lessons of the Old Testament. Noah, a righteous man, blameless in his generation, had been forewarned that the grotesqueries of the vice-ridden human world would soon be wiped clean. God has decided to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence, and chooses Noah and his family alone to survive. So, following God's instructions, Noah gathers up the species of the earth by twos and brings them aboard a magnificent vessel of his own making, to ensure that all of the innocent creations will survive. 2 of every kind shall come into you and keep them alive. Bob notes, Noah keeps these creatures alive while the floodwaters rise, tending to them while the rest of humankind drowns in God's vengeance and sets them loose upon a replenished planet in the wake of this cleansing devastation. As a sign of fealty to his God, though, he selects a few of the animals he saved and burns them on an altar. For this effort, Noah is rewarded, striking a new covenant with God. 2 of every race, Bob says with a wink and a smile, pushing backward in his oak chair, writing us into scripture and turning it into a joke. 2 of every race, he repeats, as if that simple phrase is a shorthand that everyone can understand, as if it explains everything. As he says this, the radiator pipes that run against the wall, wrapped in blue and yellow wallpaper decorated with pineapples, clang and shudder. The great big oil burner in the basement has kicked into action, and the sound is terrifying, a terrifying confirmation of the seriousness of the ark that our parents have built. As a young child, I heard the fanatical messianic tones of his sermon, and I believe. It takes me years or decades to understand the importance of the wink and the smile, the warm sense of humor that undercuts the Holy Writ. two of every race. Saying it this way, Bob twists the line of race and family, of skin and kin. We nod, understanding the Old Testament reference, acknowledging the sins of the world. The environment is collapsing, Bob continues. The planet cannot sustain life. He will build something, he tells us, to keep us safe. We are innocents meant to survive an apocalypse and meant as well to remake the earth in its wake. We are also a sacrifice. Which of us, I wonder to myself, looking around, will die? While he speaks, my fingertips cling tightly to the edge of the table, and my flesh commits to memory the slickness of the varnish surface, the rustle of the newspaper, the timbre of his voice, the shared fear that the world is coming to an end. And at night, assuming the worst, I lie in bed and design bomb shelters with modernist furniture, pocket rooms, and underwater swimming pools, a fit home for the bunch of us during the long nuclear winter. Sheryl turns out the light. Alone with fingers curled around my blankets in bed, I anticipate the early tremble of an earthquake, the roar of an oncoming tidal wave, the slow hiss of the flood that comes with an endless downpour. My eyelids grow heavy, and when I finally give in and fall asleep, I am at least comforted that we together are meaningful, that we have a wondrous purpose, that a vengeful God will find in our assembly a reason to pass over the White House with the picket fence. Again, it is important that you understand that we are well-tended, loved, and celebrated, that you don't expect a dystopian narrative, one that is full of reality television drunks with their crashed cars, messy divorces and catastrophic affairs, their self-loathing and violence, their habitual confinement in reform schools and prison, even if some of those things, by the end of it, are a part of the story, even if some of those things wreck us. It's important also that you acknowledge the depth of care in this house for one another, for our parents, and for the very concept of us, even if later, despite that same ethos, we sometimes make decisions that hurt one another, that hurt ourselves, that hurt all of us at once, even if bad things seep in, even if sometimes we encourage that seepage. And it is important because while the rains definitely come, and while we're all tossed and turned, and some of us are heaved overboard, the world does not end. So, it's...
Whew, okay. This was one of those assignments I took on before I knew what I was getting into. I was like, I opened up, I was like, oh, okay. This is gonna be amazing and really hard. So, Matt, I mean, this is pretty remarkable project for you to take on. I don't know how many of you have the memoir yet, but I just want to say a couple things about it in general. The experience reading it was so remarkably emotionally intimate and intellectually sophisticated at the same time that I couldn't quite figure out where I was engaging at the moment. I was like, okay, am I having an intellect? That's like an incredible insight. I'm like, oh my God, but it's so emotionally overwhelming. I don't even know what to do. And how you were able to do that so consistently is really extraordinary on a topic that is virtually impossible to write in some sort of, I wouldn't say coherent way, but more a way that doesn't invoke the nod, nod, wink, wink in a way. It's sort of like, how can we possibly get clear on this impossible thing? So I guess what I wanted to ask you just broadly as a way in, I'm sure you struggled thinking about, obviously what to include, how to include it, what not to include. But the themes that run through it are so, they feel so alive to me and intentional. I'm wondering, did you decide on the sort of themes you were going to deal with? For example, just the impossible boundaries of race. Every time you think you're a little bit clear about one, something happens or someone says something, or there's this amazing scene where the church, I'll let you tell the story, I suppose, but the trick is that they're asked to be like a living nativity scene because they're this whole perfect, multiracial family, but the whole time I'm reading, I'm like, well, if you had a multiracial church, you wouldn't need to find these children. You could have just had the whole, everyone in the church. So I'm like, well, you need an all-white church for this to make sense. And then I'm like, what are they thinking? And then, so that's just a small example, but it happens over and over and over, and it's the repetition of it that's so profound, right? That, you've one boundary and you think you have an identity, and then someone else, changes that. So did you think about that as a theme, or did this just happen in my mind while, while I was reading? I mean, were you thinking, I'm going to really, really play this up? How did you think about that?
Oh, I mean, I think you're right. I wouldn't say that it was so carefully planned in the way that you're describing it, but there's definitely no certainty that emerges from the story. Like, it's a story of being perpetually confused when confronted with a momentary flash of certainty about one particular situation that is then undone in the very next year or the very next semester or quarter or the next day. So it's meant to really be a challenging story about thinking you have certainty and learning that you have absolutely none.
Right. And there were so many moments where it was just your sort of typical 1970s suburban, near New York family, because, I was raised in New York, not New Jersey. I know we debate this a lot. We draw a very clear line about
New
those
Jersey's
things.
obviously better.
But, but it was, on the one hand, it was so sort of, solid and familiar and sort of, stable. And then all of a sudden, everything would be unstable in a critical way. So let me ask just a couple of questions, examples on this racial boundary piece. So I mentioned the church example, but I wanted to talk a little bit about just the, Bear and his identity here, because it's as if he's too dangerous for everywhere. Can you talk a little bit about that for people? Sort of how did you... Yeah, that seems really important to the entire memoir to me. That he's too dangerous to stay in Vietnam. He's too dangerous to be black in America. He's too black in America. He's too black over there too, but he's not really in any way Asian over here. It's like that we don't care about that. But so anyway, can you just share a little bit about how you were thinking about that?
Sure. So Bear is brought when he's 5 years old. He's 45 days older than me, as I said. His mother, May, who is still very much in our lives, had a series of children, all of them mixed race, all of them with African-American soldiers in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, at the time, she was understood as a collaborator. And as a consequence, the kids, both because they were her children and because they were mixed race, were really viewed with outright hostility, if not suspicion. So it was entirely unsafe for them to be in an ordinary school or to live an ordinary life. So they lived on a school run by this extraordinary couple he's a sort of ex-British Air Force guy who's interested in sort of saving the children of the world. It's an Indian couple who've repatriated to Vietnam to run what's called the Hope School, and he creates this mixed race paradise for kids right next to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It's a marginal space, so most people are familiar with the last few months of the U.S. occupation in Saigon, when there's a well-orchestrated exodus of personnel and people. Very famously, there's a plane that crashes with children who were kept aborted. It's a great tragedy of that moment. The Hope School and Bear are not a part of this story. They're forgotten until the very last few hours of the U.S. occupation. And in the last minute, this man, Victor Srinivasan, manages to grab about 15 kids and throw them on the plane. They make their way all the way to the U.S. And then as soon as Bear is adopted, that story itself is pretty complicated, and we could take the whole day to talk about that.
No, right.
He joins this family of ours behind the white picket fence at the White House, and he is, once there, both thrilled to be relatively safe, isolated from his siblings who've been adopted to other families, so he had to part ways with his brother and his sister, and dangerous in a very different sort of way, because he grows very quickly into an extraordinary athlete. And he's a very large, very strong, deep-voiced dark-skinned man who, despite his mixed-race heritage, is understood almost exclusively as black. So one of the quests of his life is to kind of reassert a mixed-race identity. And these days he goes to great lengths to try to assure people that he is both black and Vietnamese. He's a fluent cook in both genres, if that's a thing, and will often dress to confuse in some way. But as he gets older, as a teenage, oversized black child or black man, he becomes a different kind of dangerous, a more familiar kind of dangerous to us, in that he's a threat in a number of ways. So he's a threat partly because he's an all-state linebacker. He's incredibly charming. He's like a much better version of myself. That's how I describe him in the book, as a perpetually more interesting and more exciting version of me. But also, living in an all-white town, dating white girls, and running afoul of the police, and then goes to college, and the same sort of story follows him over and over again. So, and the book ends. I don't know if this is where you wanted me to go with it, but when I started writing the book, I reached out to him right away. We're quite close, and I've often talked about us as twins, and we did sort of twinning things when we were younger, and would jokingly present ourselves as twins in public often. It was funny.
It was worth repeating a few times, right? You were like, let's do it again.
But when I started talking to him about writing this memoir and asking him to remember what it was like to grow up, he had very positive things to say. So the voice of Bear in the book is introduced chronologically in the way that I wrote the book. So at the front end of the book, he's telling me, that he has always felt protected in the family. He's always felt that wherever my father was, he was safe, and that wherever Bob could extend himself, there was both privacy and security. But by the end of the book, Bob has been dead for 20 years, and Bear, on his way home from a family reunion, or the day after he returns from a family reunion, is on his way to work, and is chased by a small group of white supremacists and beaten with a baseball bat in the parking lot across the street from his work. Because he is Bear, and because he's a black belt in karate and a former linebacker, he was able to disarm these people, but it's only by virtue of sheer luck that he's still alive. And it's the real punctuation of the book, that this man has gone from a childhood of danger to a life of danger, and wherever he is has never really been safe, even if he has sometimes felt that way.
I was really struck by how your father was able to sort of create this sort of extended veil of protection in what was such a small town. He's sort of outsized presence. Do you think he planned that? I mean, of course, there's a lot of places you could have lived in New Jersey in small iterations like this town. Do you think he was thinking he needed to protect this multiracial family? Was it racially conscious, or was it just typical sort of fatherly, patriarchal, I've got to protect my kids, or because it seemed that he spent a lot of time sort of checking in with the authorities and giving the kids some sort of newfangled version of the police talk. It wasn't quite the one that I recall getting, but it had its own, its own valence, I meant to say.
No, I think absolutely he did it. He did all of this on purpose. He was my father was a judge in Central Jersey, and a lawyer before that, and was very integrated with the state and county and local municipal police forces, and knew most of the police chiefs and officers really quite well. So he was quite mindful of the impact of race on policing, and would talk about it quite openly in the House, and introduced us all to police officers whenever they came. Used that introduction as a way to sort of walk us through how to conduct ourselves in front of the police, but did far more than that, and I think this is where you're going. So he would attach, it's hard to explain if you haven't been to New Jersey, but he would attach sort of symbols of his judgeship to the front and back of the car. He would, in a version of Whistling Vivaldi, he would ensure that the cars were always clean, washed.
You all wash them every
Yes,
weekend.
yeah, we were
We should be
enlisted.
neighbors. We had two hose.
We were enlisted to wash them, and then, in moments where things went sideways, as they often did, for Bear in particular, and an evening out at a bar could precipitate a brush with the police. He would immediately extend himself to do whatever he could. If that meant calling a local police chief somewhere else or reaching out to make contacts, he would do that rapidly. And spoke again was as his children grew older, a deep student or a careful student of race relations and the political economy of race. And so his ideological life moved rapidly towards a more keenly self-aware position on racial policing and the racial state as he grew older.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask, and maybe this wasn't my sequence, but it might fit better here, because there's so much sort of reflection on how race is shaping your lives and your identities as young people, but there isn't much about how your parents may have evolved on these questions, right?
Yeah.
So I was going to ask that, sort of how, I guess, the sense was this was going to save the world from itself. I can imagine they decided that maybe wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
Okay, just checking. But did they feel cynical about that? Did they think, were they sort of frustrated with white people's responses? Like, what was the sort of framework that he moved to as he got older on this? Because all of you are shifting as you grow, but I don't get a sense of them, and I really wanted to know how he felt about that.
Well, I think that's a great question. It's a clear answer with him. I think my mom is a little bit more private and maybe a little bit more consistent, I think, over the course of her life. He was a real student of history, and this is like way inside baseball for the historians in the room. But he moved from like 1975 to 1990, basically being a student of Thomas Jefferson to a student of John Brown, and then moved and a student of Ulysses Grant, like sort of fell in love with people who were advocates of radical Reconstruction or radical abolitionism, even as he maintained a position as a sort of well-respected judge. He wasn't a firebrand, he was a sort of middle-of-the-road person, a family court justice. But in his private life and in his reading, he sort of moved in a very different kind of direction, and reversed course on a number of fronts. His position on things like affirmative action moved to the left as he grew older. His commitment to educating judges changed. So as he got older, this isn't in the book, it's just you asking this question. But for him, this was a really radical step. Like he bought copies of Randall Kennedy's Race, Crime, and the Law for all the judges in the state, made sure they all had it, fostered conversations about criminal policing. And that, for a guy of his age and his generation, was a lot.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Wow. So in the beginning, in the preface you read, that this was an experiment, and their place in the experiment is clear. For me, an experiment has a question, right? You're asking.
Yeah.
Right. So what is the question that was being asked that required this experiment to answer?
I think these are young people not much older than the students we teach in the classroom, right? Not much older than people we know. And I think they're asking, what can we do together? Mm-hmm. So they're, on some level, they're recognizing, it's 1968, 1969, mm-hmm. when they're dating, engaged, and married. Mm-hmm. They're planning to start a family. They're entirely dissatisfied with the state of the world. The racial position of the country has turned south and gone horribly. You're approaching Earth Day, and there's the sense that the world's physical state is also deteriorating. And yet at the same time, they're both fairly cautious people, and neither one of them is going to be a kind of James Lawson type. So they're not going to get overalls and suspenders and go out there, and they're not going to burn things down and march. And so whatever combination of personalities they had, they fostered this idea that maybe they could do something domestically.
Right.
Maybe they could do something on a smaller scale. And the Cold War, of course, invests all sorts of energy and power in the family as a kind of vehicle of the state. And it is the nation in miniature in so many ways. And
Well, that's the part I was,
Yeah.
that gets to the experiment part, right? Because it's sort of saying, can you constitute a family, right, that is in a sense intent, sort of planned to be so racially disparate in the context where, you know, repeatedly throughout the memoir, you find ways to remind the reader that, you know, family is a racial construct, certainly in this country. And so every moment you're all sort of running up against it. So for me, I was wondering if the experiment was really about the constitution of the family, because it could say, he could have said, it's not an experiment, it's the articulation of my vision, right? This is the vision I have for the world, so this is my effort to create it the best way I can. But an experiment implies something else to me, and that's why I was I'm just giving you some context for what I was thinking when I asked about the issue of the word experiment in particular.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that an experiment is an attempt and not a clinical thing. They're engaged in an attempt.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's an attempt to make a difference, to move the needle, to change the world, to do it one family at a time, one block at a time.
Right.
And they, neither of them, and especially not my father, they're not kind of clinically scientific thinkers. They're humanists at heart, in a way. And so their hope is to provide a kind of symbolic, a powerfully symbolic idea or concept that can move hearts and minds.
That makes sense. That's helpful. So I have a couple more few questions because I think we'll be able to open it up for discussion after that. But I wanted to talk a bit about the kind of well, I have a couple questions around this. But so there's this, do you know the Eddie Murphy skit from Saturday Night Live 100 years ago where he dresses in whiteface and goes and does all this stuff that white people do when black people aren't around? So they get to ride free on the bus. You know, the bus driver checks and makes sure there's nobody else watching. And so just get on. You know, and the whole time, you know, you're laughing hysterically. Of course, white people are the same when you're there and when you're not. But then after reading your memoir, like, oh, I guess, you know, maybe not. So can you talk a little bit about how right Eddie Murphy was, apparently, that there's this whole kind of performance that you are just, it's very, very powerfully written, this performance of whiteness that is so unconsciously identifying itself as not black all the time, right? And the way in which you're sort of passing as white and also white, listening from a non-white-ish white position. It's very complicated, right? And then sort of but then not knowing what quite to do in those moments, right? And sort of how you feel about, well, what level of confrontation would work, and should I be friends with these people? I mean, all of this gets invoked so powerfully. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that kind of racial boundary, that kind of identity, and that inside. It's a different kind of inside baseball than history.
I love that skit. This is White Like Me, I think it's called, on Saturday Night Live, which everyone should watch. And I think this story repeats a couple of times in the book, but or this theme repeats a couple of times. But the particular story I think that best illustrates it is about me and Bear and a high school party that Bear threw at our house afterwards. That we were close, but Bear, though he was larger than I, did not always stick up for me. And so there were a couple of occasions when we were younger where on the bus ride home from school, I'd been picked on and people had thrown my shoes out the window and Bear had not really stood up for me at all. And so I would chew him out. And so I was always looking to see if he would stick up for me. And one weekend my parents were away and there was a party in the yard, and Bear learned that I'd gotten in a fist fight the week earlier, and it's a very New Jersey way of saying this, but this big Italian kid, Joey Patone, punched me and all of my friends in the head and knocked us out. We were trying to get into a party and we couldn't get into it. It was a sort of an ordinary Saturday night in New Jersey at the time. So, but Bear learned about this and was furious, or performatively furious. And so it's late at night, we're in the backyard, and he's hearing me and my two friends tell this story, and he's outraged and had some stuff to drink, and he grabs a sort of mouth-breathing friend from down the block, David Hendershot, and they get into Bear's 240Z. He has a primer grade 240Z because, again, it's New Jersey, and he says that he's going to go find Joey Patone in Roselle, which is like the Italian Mecca in Central Jersey, and not where you would go on a Saturday night if you were a black guy in a primer gray 240Z. But as he pulls out the driveway, two things are happening simultaneously. I am like moved like beyond words that my brother, whom I love and look up to, has finally decided that he is going to go kick Joey Patone's ass and stand up for me. And as I'm thinking this and feeling this, my friends at the time say, like, we just turned the N-word loose. Like, he's going to go kick their asses. And so they're in that moment, now that the black figure has left, they feel comfortable, telling me how they really feel about my brother and about his weaponization in that moment. And I, of course, realize the second thought is the one that matters the most, is that Big Joey Patone is in Roselle surrounded by all those white guys, and that and Bear is headed in that direction in his 240Z. And I recognize that while he might have been a black belt and an all-state linebacker, he's not going to be able to beat up 40 Italian kids from Roselle. So I'm terrified. Like, I move through that series of emotions, the disgust with my friends, the excitement that Bear is going to stick up for me, the disillusionment, and the terror that he might himself get hurt. And that scene, Bear, of course, just to reassure everybody, is too smart to go to Roselle and find Big Joey. So he just drove around on the back roads with David Hendershot and came back very soon after that and had some more beer. And to be honest, what I remember most about that moment is that I really wasn't disappointed when he came back. I was just grateful that he was safe, because whatever I had wanted him to do for me in that moment would have brought him enormous harm and danger. But that experience of having private conversations with white people I assumed were my friends, and having them in moments of great privacy say when they felt they could, say the most horrific things is a theme of the book, and something that continues to the present. So it's a very strange thing. It runs right through graduate school and through most of my adult life, that the disclosure of this family story creates a sense among the white people I have met, or some of them at least, that they can share grievances with me in some way, and that I have an insight into white grievance that will connect us. And so friendships become shallow. Maybe, Beverly, this is where your book on trauma should be deployed. But friendships become shallow because you keep having the same conversation over and over again.
So let me push a little bit in here,
Please.
into this little corner here, because a few things are going on as a reader for me. One was, well, you're sort of stuck with these two guys calling him this he's unleashed this N-word, and they say it a few times. And you say in the memoir that you just basically have a sip of beer but don't say anything.
Yep. Yeah.
And then you feel guilty forever about this.
Yeah.
But you don't say what happens later. So do you say anything to Bear? Do you ever say anything to him? I mean, is this the first time he's hearing this when he reads this? I mean, what happened? And then I have something for comic relief, so hang in there.
Well, a series of things happen in both slow and fast motion. So, like, that is basically the end of my friendship. But what I write in the book, and what sticks with me now is not there's no moment where the tables are turned and where I tell them to, get out of my house or go home, but instead I freeze. And that happens a couple of times in the book too, that this moment is so much, over so many things happening at once that I'm paralyzed. And when I talk about the haptic in the book, these are these moments where I recall too much in my fingertips. Like I can remember the feel of the flaking paint on the back porch in the precise moment that those friends uttered the word and that I did nothing. I remember it like it is today. And I remember that I did nothing, right? Bear, I could never have brought myself to tell him that story. So the first time he learned about it was when he read the book.
And what did he say? Or is that, no, we're not allowed to know that because he hasn't authorized that. But I mean, this to me is like at the heart of what's going on in the book a lot of the time, it seems to me, right? That these worldly racial identities and hierarchies infuse moments that feel so intimate and beyond that space. And then because people are in a level of intimacy that they wouldn't normally have, quote unquote, in such a cross-racial and complicated way, that it paralyzes not just you in some cases, but others, to not explore the very next thing that the whole experiment has forced onto the table.
Right.
So, I mean, so that's why I'm asking, because you and Bear obviously have a really close relationship here, it seems, but that seems like a hard thing to not talk about,
Well, by then, I mean, just to sort of think through the narrative of the book and of my life, by then we've already had a series of debriefings about incidents much like this. So this is not the first such incident, but one of several like that, and some more dramatic than that. And I didn't want to bring him any more pain. He also hated those people anyway. So there was no.
Right.
It's not like I needed to warn him away from those two guys.
No, that's true. That's true. But the other theme, and I'm going to leave this alone, but it's really
No,
interesting to me. It's just super
This is the
interesting.
comic moment that you promised.
No, the comic moment is that had you been black, you would have known he was never going to Joey Patone's
No, that's right.
I mean, he's like,
That's
what?
right.
I mean, he would have been like, you would have said, he's not going over there. It's ridiculous, right? But here you all are in the same moment, and yet living entirely different
Totally
identities
convinced.
because nobody's going in
Absolutely
the middle
convinced.
of the night, It's like he's going to have to defend you another way and another time. But no, what I was just going to say is that there are just so many complicated ways where a lot is said and nothing's said. So just on this front, that you and Mark, your biological brother, didn't talk about racial identity till you're in your 50s. I just don't even know. I'm like, Matt, what were you doing for 50 years? Did it just never come up? You ask. I mean, I circled it like 90 times. You're like, he says, well, did other whites do to you what they did to me, which was use the N-word in this all-white world? And he was like, yeah, every day, all the time, 100%.
Yeah, that's an exact quote, actually.
Yeah, I know. I've read it many times.
It's an odd. I've struggled with this in writing the book. Like it's an odd. I don't want to call it this, but I think I'll just use it as a shorthand. It's an odd dysfunction of this particular family, that though race was everywhere and in all things, and though we talked about race in the abstract all the time,
Right.
we only very rarely and usually only painfully talk to each other about it. So by that in those moments where there were moments where there was some levity, and we learned to sort of joke about race, but more often than not, where race entered the family, it was quite painful, and we avoided any opportunity to talk about it.
Right.
Mark, upon reading the book, has said that he's sort of joked that he was perpetually 3 and doesn't remember any of this.
Yeah.
And
Which
that
you
he was,
sort of say at other points, that he
yeah,
avoided chores.
he was
but-
always left out as the younger
Is
and
that
less
yeah.
interesting brother.
So, I mean, how do you feel this sort of shaped who you are, and how do you ultimately feel about it? I know that sounds like a simple question, but I mean, there's so many intense and not contradictory, but just multifaceted, right, kinds of experiences. Do you have a sense of sort of, do you think your parents, you know, do you have, I mean, like, is there an overarching sort of response to that? Sort of, gee, they tried their best. This is an impossible world. This was a really courageous experiment, which I think all of this is true. And on the other hand, it's like, what could you have not known about race that would make you think this was going to work out all right, you know, in a small white town in New Jersey? No offense, you know, to New Jersey. But do you know what I mean? I mean, sort of, so what would you say? I mean, how does it feel? I mean, I just want people
Yeah.
to, because it comes through here, but it's not, we're not talking about that. So I just want to bring us through that.
I mean, first of all, I just have to say that it's not New Jersey that failed. I want it to be clear and on the record.
Okay. It is duly noted.
Yeah, duly noted. Thank you. I mean, I think it was comforting to write the book in part because I had to wrestle with exactly that question. And what I left with was rather the sense that I had both great respect and profound concern about what my parents had tried to do. And I don't really think I have to reconcile or even can reconcile those contradictions. That they were both big-spirited, big-hearted people who tried to do something at a moment when far too few people tried to do anything or cared enough to take a risk at great personal cost. But they were also creatures of their time whose capacity to imagine a better world was limited by their upbringing, and I think they would be the first to say that it did not work the way that they had thought it would work.
Right.
And that they did the best they could.
Yeah.
My mom continues to say that this was the most important thing she ever did. And I think that's at once both a thing every mom says, right? Like, the most important thing I ever did was to have children and to raise this family. But she also means that in the doubled sense of this, that the most important thing she did is in the most important political act she ever undertook as a human in this world. And I would always rather someone tried and made an attempt than not.
Right. That's helpful. Okay, this is the very last question, so you all get ready. I swear, it's the very last one, but I can't not ask this. So there are a couple of moments near the end of the book where Sandy, our dear Sandy, asks you this question, which I think is super important and interesting. She says, would you have married me if you hadn't grown up in your family? And you try some deflections, which go nowhere, by the way. She's like, not falling for that, buddy. I mean,
Right.
she asks
Yeah,
again. I'm just shorthanding here, but I think this is a really interesting sort of question, and I think it's kind of at the heart of a lot of what goes on in the memoir. So tell us about that exchange and what you know. Well, one of your answers has to do with saying, well, I'll let you quote that if you want to.
No, which one did you like?
Well, no, well, it's just that you say, my wife Sandy asks the question seriously about, would you have married me if you hadn't grown up in your family? So my wife Sandy asks the question seriously, holding me hostage to the terrifying abstraction of the average white man. But then you reply eventually, you married me because I was once a part of something dangerous, and because that something changed us for the better.
Yeah, what I said. I think that was a lot of what I put in the book is stuff that happened while I was writing the book, and that particular conversation happened in the midst of sort of thinking, if you were writing the story of your family, what would you say? Or if you were writing a memoir about all of the people in your life you called brother and sister, how would you describe that and its impact on you? And I think her question really moved me in a way, because it came at almost the same moment that my dissertation director asked me a very different version of the same question, which was, well, so what was this all for? Like, why did it even matter? And I think those two questions together really led me to sort of wonder what impact it had made on me, like selfishly, he says, and vaingloriously, he says, right? Like, what did it make me a different person? Not that that was the end game or the ambition of the enterprise at all, but that it's a side effect to a certain extent.
And would you say yes is the answer to that question, or?
I would.
We got to answer Sandy's. We can't leave Sandy
No,
hanging
we
here
can't.
with
We
all
can't
this.
leave Sandy hanging. You know, I don't. We continue to have that conversation, and I would say I'm gonna answer it a little differently, and I'm gonna answer it in the way that that I've heard her talk about this since, that for her the difference is that she was able to enter a family where she didn't have to worry about the quotidian white family. And so she was able to marry into a family where conversations about race or comfort with race were already present. And she didn't have to worry about joining a family of like 6 white brothers with all their blinders and privilege. And all of the awkward aunts and uncles who, said racist things and made her life difficult. So that's another way to sort of answer the question, is that it made us different in the sense that it made us a more receptive place for anyone to join.
Right. Well, I mean, for me, I don't know about the marrying or not, but to say, would you have been, no, I don't want to speak to that. I mean, I'm not getting in the middle of that. I'm married long enough to know where you stay and where you don't. But for me, as a friend and just as a reader, I was thinking, well, of course, if you hadn't grown up in this family, you'd be entirely different. And then you'd also be very much the same. But it seems that on every page you're telling us this makes such a difference, race, but it makes no difference at all at the same time, sort of on a layered way. But so I think, part of what makes it such an interesting question is about, how racial identity is a social formation insofar as you can't make sense of it if it isn't functioning in the social world. Everything down to the, the white picket fence, to the nativity scenes, to all of the things that you described so well. So for me, it's not so much about the marry part. It's more about, would I be me? What about me would be interesting and relevant, and what makes me a different kind of white person, or a different, for your brothers and sister, different kind of, so on and so forth. There's too many to list, but do you know what I mean? So it's about that dynamic that I think is really interesting.
I mean, maybe it's my smooth dance moves.
I don't know. I can't speak. I haven't seen, you have to show us some of those before we.
I think one question, another question people have asked, so very few people have actually even read the book. You're one of like 50 at this point, because it's just 10 days old. And one of the questions that's come up has been asked a little differently, and it's been about adoption. Like, do you think your parents should have adopted these children? So do you recommend adoption at all? And do you think your parents made a mistake by bringing these kids together? Which is the way people ask the question. So I'm just repeating the question. But the answer, I think, is related to the question you've asked, because the answer is like, you're asking me to undo myself to answer that question. Like, I can't. I have 5 siblings. I can't imagine myself not in relation to them. And I can't conceive of a family structure or a sense of myself without it being so closely connected to who they are and who we are together, that it's hard for me to even imagine being asked that question, let alone answering it in the affirmative.
Yeah.
I might have complicated and contradictory feelings when it comes to the subject of transracial adoption in the abstract. But when it comes to who I am and it comes to my siblings, it's impossible for me to imagine that being with them hasn't made all of us different in some way, shape, or form, because that's just how families work.
Right.